Okay, so we got a really interesting request from a listener to do a deep dive into this YouTube podcast about the secrets of the billionaire mindset.
Okay.
And we always love to kind of like take a look at these kinds of things and see like, okay, what can we pull out, and is it valuable?
Yeah.
Is it fluff?
Right.
And so what we're going to do today is kind of like go through this podcast really quickly,
Yep.
pull out the most important things, and hopefully leave you with some really like useful and actionable takeaways about how to think more like a billionaire.
Right.
And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind as we go through this is that, you don't need to be a billionaire to think like one.
Okay.
And actually, a lot of these mindsets are things that we can all benefit from.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, let's just jump right in.
Okay.
So this podcast highlighted like 4 key areas. And the first one is thinking long term.
Yeah. And this is a big one. This idea of like thinking in decades, not days.
Right.
The podcast gave examples like Elon Musk with his vision for SpaceX, like aiming to colonize Mars.
Yeah.
Or Oprah building her media empire over 30 years, 40 years?
Yeah, decades.
Yeah, it's about setting these massive goals and then like really just chipping away at them, relentlessly.
Right. And I think like a key part of that is this idea of delayed gratification. Like being willing to kind of like put off some of those short-term rewards.
Absolutely. Like foregoing that instant
Wow.
gratification for something much bigger down the line.
Yeah. And I think, like for most of us who are not billionaires, like that's a really hard thing to do.
It is. It's really challenging because, we're kind of conditioned to seek those quick wins,
Right.
But if we can start to shift our perspective and think about, okay, what do I want my life to look like in 10 years, 20 years even?
Yeah.
It can really change the way we approach things.
Totally. And what's interesting is that like even for those of us who aren't aiming to be billionaires, like I think that mindset shift can be so powerful.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the second secret that this podcast talked about was viewing problems as opportunities.
Oh, yeah. This is a good one. So instead of seeing problems as these like roadblocks, these things that stop us in our tracks,
Yeah.
billionaires tend to look at problems and they think opportunity.
Yeah.
Like what can I create? What can I solve?
Right.
They gave some great examples in the podcast.
Yeah. What were some of those?
Well, they talk about Jeff Bezos, right?
Mhm.
So he saw how inefficient traditional bookstores were.
Yeah.
And that's literally what sparked the idea for Amazon.
Wow.
Yeah. And then Sarah Blakely, who invented Spanx,
Mm-hmm.
she basically just, she was getting dressed one day and she was like, there's got to be a better way,
Oh, yeah.
to make my clothes look smoother. And that's how Spanx was born.
Right. So it's like not even necessarily like a huge problem,
Yeah.
but just like a little inconvenience.
Yeah, like an inefficiency or a gap in the market.
Totally. Yeah. And it's like that mindset of not just complaining about it. Exactly.
But like really leaning into the challenge and saying, okay, like, how can this be done better?
Yeah, it's about being proactive,
Yeah.
instead of reactive.
Yeah. So I think like a good question for our listeners to think about is
Okay.
like, what's a current frustration that you have in your life? And could you reframe that as a potential opportunity?
Right. Like, what's the solution that's waiting to be discovered in that frustration?
Totally. Okay. So moving on to the third key mindset that they talked about was an obsession with learning. And I mean like a serious obsession.
Right. This isn't like casual reading before bed. This is like dedicating huge chunks of time to consuming knowledge.
Yeah.
They talked about Warren Buffett, for example.
Okay.
They said he spends something like 80% of his day reading.
Wow.
And Bill Gates is another great example. He takes these think weeks where he just isolates himself and like dives deep into books and articles.
That's amazing. And I think, like it's interesting because it's like they treat knowledge as this fundamental asset. Oh, absolutely. It's an investment.
Yeah.
In their success.
Yeah.
They're not just passively absorbing information. They're actively seeking it out.
Right. And I think like for a lot of us, like we might say, oh, yeah, I value learning.
Right.
But like how much time are we actually dedicating to it,
Exactly. Are we carving out that space in our days to really focus on expanding our knowledge?
Yeah. So it's like a good question for all of us to think about.
For sure.
Okay. So the last mindset that they talked about, and this one's kind of counterintuitive, I think, is embracing failure.
Yeah, this is the one that kind of throws people off, but it's so important.
Yeah.
The podcast really emphasized that billionaires, they don't see failure as the end.
Right.
They see it as a learning opportunity, as feedback.
Yeah.
every single billionaire they mentioned in that podcast had experienced massive failures multiple times.
Yeah.
They've had businesses that went bankrupt. They've had products that flopped. They've had ideas that just totally tanked.
And I think like what's interesting about that is that it's not just about like failing and then like brushing it off and moving on. It's about really like dissecting those failures and saying, okay, like what went wrong?
Exactly.
Like what can I learn from this?
What can I do differently next time?
And how can I use this to actually make me better?
It's about resilience, right? It's about adapting and iterating.
Totally. And I think like that's a really hard mindset to adopt.
It is. It's so counterintuitive because we're kind of taught to avoid failure,
Right.
But if we can reframe it as this like necessary step on the path to success,
Yeah.
it can be really powerful.
Absolutely. So basically the 4 key mindsets that we talked about today are
Okay.
thinking long-term, viewing problems as opportunities, prioritizing learning, and embracing failure.
Yeah.
And like I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that you don't need to be a billionaire to start thinking like one.
Right. These are mindsets that anyone can cultivate.
Totally. And I think, like just by being aware of these mindsets, we can start to shift our own thinking and hopefully start to see some positive changes in our own lives.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for our listeners.
Okay.
Of those 4 mindset shifts that we talked about, which one do you think would have the biggest impact on your life? And what's one small step that you can take today to start implementing it?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Something for everyone to ponder.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.